I call Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. This has been a farce of a democratic process. This is an alarming trend. It is happening more and more often, this use of urgency by the national government. Do they just not want to talk to the people they presume to represent? Every single one of the submissions, oral and written, made special note of the ludicrous timeframe given to the Select Committee and also everyday New Zealanders to give their input to Select Committee members. The anger and frustration that was apparent from those who made the efforts to turn up at such short notice before the Select Committee was highly evident. If this was all so urgent, why did every other party in this House vote to break for the holidays this week? Why was New Zealand First the only party that asked the question, hold on, why break so early? Don't we have these very important issues to consider to put before the people of New Zealand? Right. New Zealand First was the only party that opposed these dates, and this bill was just one of the many reasons why. But no, the government wanted to go on holiday. You cannot agree with the supposed changes to this bill when the entire process used to achieve that outcome was flawed in all of its parts. Our Select Committee heard from the likes of the Human Rights Commission, the New Zealand Law Society, the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties, the Legislation Advisory Committee. Every single one of these groups spoke about the travesty of the truncated process, especially for this bill and the large and wide-reaching implications to all New Zealanders. You cannot, in good conscience, sit on that committee and agree with every single person who spoke to us. You cannot stand in this House and speak of this travesty of human justice, state that this process has been a farce, and then say we reached a compromise and it's okay. You can't say...
Order. Don't bring me into the debate.
Because you didn't... You can't... Sorry. It cannot be said because we didn't even... get a chance to read every submission, say it's okay, we reached a compromise, especially when no compromise has been reached. We still have a 3-year period on the cancellation of passports. We still have new warrantless surveillance rights. We still have new video surveillance rights. And we still have the situation that evidence collected without a warrant can be retained by these security agencies. Every time we asked the question of those standing before us, we got the same answer. Every time we asked, what do you think? Every time we asked, what would you have done instead? Every time we asked, what would you do? We got the same answer, and the answer was always accusatory. The answer, we don't know, you didn't give us enough time to think this through. Sir Geoffrey Palmer said it best perhaps, where legislation is rushed, it often goes wrong. I know and acknowledge all of the Select Committee members in that room were looking to achieve the best for all New Zealanders, but we cannot and should not be the sole critique of legislation that alters the fundamental rights of all New Zealanders. We did not give New Zealanders their just chance to speak. We are told there is a threat, and New Zealand First does not disagree that there is one. In fact, members of this party have been part of New Zealand's armed forces. We were willing to stand up then, and we are willing to vehemently fight against terrorism now, but this bill does not do that. However, what is our threat warning? Possible but not likely. This government's urgency applies a clear and present danger. New Zealand First accept that there is a threat and the security setting has changed, but we think the threat does not justify this bill in these circumstances. I question also the pressure of the Cricket World Cup. During the Rugby World Cup, the American team played on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And what was the solution at the time? They beefed up security. They didn't change the law, they acted accordingly, and they acknowledged that there might be a risk. They stated it was a low one, and our right to privacy and our human rights were left alone then, and they should be left alone now. The Prime Minister has used the ISIL conflict in his rhetoric to justify the development and the extension of these intrusive powers. The UN Security Council Resolution 2178 asks New Zealanders to do all we can to restrict the movement of foreign terrorist fighters. Rightfully so. We should not be letting New Zealanders take arms in support of terrorist organisations. But this rhetoric has inflamed many in New Zealand and further isolated and marginalised good people who New Zealand First would presume to support. We need to be considerate and measured. The Law Society accepts that the international situation is moving rapidly and that the national response must keep abreast, as does New Zealand First. They finish by saying that this is not synonymous with saying that any legislation should be enacted under urgency. United Nations Special Rapporteur Ben Emerson, when submitting to the General Assembly in relation to 2178, commented that measures justified by reference to the state's duties to protect against the threat of terrorism should never be used as a Trojan horse to usher in wider powers of surveillance for unrelated governmental functions. I have found some excellent words spoken on the rights of New Zealanders and much of the public's fears that our rights are being eroded cut by cut. I quote, "We have an obligation to maintain the integrity of our democratic system, our institutions and the systems and processes of government. Here in New Zealand, we often take our democratic freedoms for granted. We think they will always be there. We have a Bill of Rights which is supposed to protect our right to freedom of expression. What on earth could go wrong?" Quote continues, "I have a different view. I believe that Thomas Jefferson said that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. There are times when we have to stand up for our rights and the rights of our neighbours and friends, and indeed the rights of people we totally disagree with, or else these rights will begin to erode away." Mr. Speaker, now that same man who spoke these so appropriate words some time ago is now the leader of our government. Under his leadership, this government is instigating a system and a process that will undermine the very democratic principles that he spoke to not so long ago. New Zealand First recognises our commitment to the UN Security Council, which requires us to prevent travel of foreign terrorist fighters, but we already have the power to do this. We can cancel passports now. But what about the rest of the obligations from the Council? What about the statement that we must reaffirm that Member States must comply with their human rights obligations when fighting terrorism, and notes that a failure to do so contributes to radicalisation? Where was this government's dialogue with religious faiths and ethnic groups? We were told in Select Committee openly and outright it had not taken place. Together with the tools and resources to prevent citizens from becoming terrorist fighters, government should engage with civil society to address the problems of communities most at risk of recruitment and radicalisation and achieve their smooth and satisfactory social integration, that from a UN Security Council address. So far, all this government has done is to inflame potentially disaffected members of our society, and it has achieved exactly what the UN Security Council warned us not to do. Mr. Speaker, when I heard in the debate among Select Committee members was an intelligent thrust and counter-thrust of arguments and ideas, I developed a high level of respect for my peers, especially on the left. But what I observed over and above the detail was the public's repeated and passionate argument that this process is flawed and undemocratic, and it has been stated many times, a rushed process can lead to flawed legislation. And we don't know, we haven't taken the time, and we won't find out if it is flawed. The government and Labor will argue that there is a sunset clause, but it is too long, too far away for those who would get caught up in what history, very recent history, has shown us to be an abused system with security agencies looking for an enemy of the state, but instead targeting enemies of the Prime Minister and other members of this House. Sir, to conclude, beyond all of these issues, information that is gathered without a warrant under this bill can be retained and used even if no warrant is granted and no subsequent warrant is sought. To clarify, information gathered without a warrant can be used by New Zealand security agencies. So nothing has changed in the Rust committee process. New Zealand First opposes this legislation.